Good morning. Today's my concept is the classification of cost of capital or types of cost of capital. The cost of capital is the rate of return on the particular investment made by the particular company on different project or the proposal. So that is called as a cost of capital or rate of return the on investment on particular project or the proposal. So there are different types of cost of capital. The first one is a explicit cost and implicit cost. Let me explain about the explicit cost. The discount rate which equates the present value of cash inflows to the present value of cash outflows. It is called as a explicit cost. So again, it is difficult to understood, or you will find it difficult to get the point because of you are not aware of the practical concept. If you have the knowledge about the present value, then it is easy to understand the concept that the discount rate which equates the present value of cash inflows to the present value of cash outflows, then it is called as a explicit cost. Mean the discount rate of the cash flows which equates the present value of cash inflows to the present value of cash outflows. Cash inflow is equal to present value of cash outflow, then it is called as explicit cost. And how to determine the explicit cost? The determination of explicit cost of capital is similar to the determination of internal rate of return. Then you have the doubt about the internal rate of return. Again, that's the concept which I explained in the previous class about internal rate of return, as well as there is a practical concept in case of internal rate of return. After calculating the internal rate of return, I hope you can understand the concept of internal rate of return. So these are the practical concept, internal rate of return or cost of capital. These are the practical concept. I am explaining only theoretical part here. So determination of explicit cost of capital means the rate of return under explicit cost is similar to like the internal rate of return. Only difference that the cash inflows and cash outflows are opposite in direction. So they are in opposite direction. If there is increase in cash inflow, outflow will decrease, and if the decrease in case of cash inflows and outflow will increase. So they are in the different direction. Otherwise, it is equal to internal rate of return. If you calculate the explicit uh, cost of capital, then it is equal to internal rate of return. Then difference only in case of inflow of cash as well as outflow of cash, they are in opposite direction. And the explicit cost of capital is the internal rate of return which a company pays for procuring the finance. Explicit cost of capital or explicit rate of return is another way, it is the internal rate of return which the company pays for procuring the finance, for getting the fund, for borrow the fund. Generally, the rate of return which the company pay for to raise the fund, the rate of return which the company pay is called as a internal rate of return. So that is under explicit cost. In another way, you can say that it is a internal rate of return. And another type is implicit cost or opportunity cost. The rate of return which can be earned by investing the capital in an alternative investment by the company or the shareholder is known as implicit cost. The rate of return which the company is going to earn by investing their fund in alternative investment, then or by the company or the shareholder, even it is applicable for the individual, is called as implicit cost. The rate of return which the investor or the company is going to get by investing on the other or optional investments or on alternative investments. So that is called as implicit cost or opportunity cost. So the implicit cost of capital arises when a company considers alternative uses of a capital. So whenever this is required, whenever the company have the plan of alternative use of capital. So therefore, the basic difference between the implicit cost as well as explicit cost is the explicit cost arises when the capital is raised. Means whenever you borrow the fund, then only cost of explicit cost comes. Whenever you borrow the fund, then the explicit cost comes, and whereas implicit cost comes are applicable whenever the capital is used. So that is about explicit cost or implicit cost. Explicit cost is related to raising of the fund, borrowing of the fund, whereas implicit cost or opportunity cost is related to using of the fund. So that's about the one type of cost of capital, explicit cost and implicit cost. The next type is historical cost and future cost. First, we will study about historical cost. It refers to the cost which has already been incurred for financing a project. It is the concept or the cost related to the fund which has been already incurred on a particular project. Historical costs are book costs which are related to past, and so they are calculated on the basis of past data. So historical cost is the cost which are related to the fund which has been already allocated or invested on a particular project. We have already started it and our process has been completed. So therefore historical costs are book costs which are related to the past, not to the present. Not we are not going to invest in the future. So it is already invested on a particular project, and the cost related to that particular project is called as a historical cost, and they are calculated based on the past data of the particular project. And next one is a future cost. It refers to the estimated cost of funds to be raised for financing a project. Estimated cost of funds. Estimated cost of funds to be raised for financing a project. Okay. In another way, the total expenses or the total fund which are required to finance a particular project. So the expenses related to raising that particular fund is called as a future cost. For example, you want to borrow the loan from different sources, then the expenses incurred or the cost you are going to incur to raise the fund is called as a future cost. So estimation of cost of funds to be raised for financing a particular project is called as a future cost. For financial decision, future costs are more relevant than historical costs. So where it will place it required play significant role in case of decision making, financial decisions making process of a particular company. The objectives of the company is to minimize the future cost of capital, not the cost incurred in the past. The main objective of the company always it is to reduce the cost of capital, reduce the future cost of capital, not the historical cost. So that is about historical cost and future cost. So future cost is a more significant than historical cost. So of course historical cost may influence at the time of taking the decisions, because through that you can study or you will come to know the errors or the mistakes which has been made in the earlier project. So for that cases it will definitely influence. So that is about historical cost and future cost. The next type is average cost and marginal cost. Average cost, it is the weighted average of the specific cost of various sources of capital. It is a weighted average of specific cost of various sources of capital. Then you should know what is specific cost. It is the calculated on the basis of cost of each source of capital and the weights assigned to them in the proportion of each source of capital in a capital structure. So it is an average weighted average of specific cost Specific cost like cost of equity, cost of preference shares, cost of retained earnings, so and so. If there is a debenture debt instrument, the cost of debenture, cost of bond, so these are called as a specific cost. The average of these is called as a weighted average cost of capital. The capital structure includes debt and equity, and the cost of debt and equity is called as a specific cost. The average of these all, the average of equity, then preference, then retained earnings, and then debentures or the bonds, the average of these cost of capital is called as a specific cost, and the average of this is called as a weighted average of specific cost. So it is calculated based on the cost of each source of capital. Each source of capital like equity, preference, debenture, bond. So these are the different sources of capital. The cost of these are taken into consideration for the calculation of weighted average cost of capital. There is a separate concept, practical concept related to weighted average cost of capital. There we can, I hope you will understood the concepts. Next one is the marginal cost. It is the weighted average cost of new or incremental funds raised by a concern or by a company or by a business. The weighted average, it is also weighted average or average, but of the cost of new or incremental funds. New funds or incremental fund, additional funds which are raised by a company. So that's called as a marginal cost. The current rate of interest on long-term debt or current rate of return is treated as marginal cost of capital. The current rate of interest on long-term debts, the rate of interest on long-term debts which are raised by the company, or current rate of return is treated as marginal cost of capital. When a firm procures additional capital from one particular source only, the marginal cost of capital is known as a specific or explicit cost of capital. Whenever a firm procures, whenever you raise the additional fund, extra, you are already raised the fund, and again whenever there is insufficient fund, you are going to raise the fund again. So at that time only the marginal cost comes. So one particular source, either through the debt securities or through the ownership, means through the equity, where if you are going to raise the fund, additional fund, then marginal cost comes. So that it is known as a specific cost or explicit cost of capital. So that is called as a about the average cost as well as a marginal cost. The next concept is the specific cost and composite cost or combined cost. So first we will study about the specific cost. The cost of each specific component or source of capital is called specific cost of capital. For example, cost of debenture, cost of equity, cost of preference share, and cost of retained earnings, like that. So cost of each specific components or source of capital. The components of capital are maybe the debenture, like mainly there are two components, debt and equity. Under debt, debentures and bond, and under equity, the equity shares, preference shares, and retained earnings. The cost which are incurred to raise these fund or these raised through these sources are called as a specific cost of capital. The cost of each specific component, the cost of debenture or cost of equity, whenever fund raised through issue of equity, or cost of preference shares whenever the fund raised through issue of preference shares. So these are called as a specific cost. The concept of specific cost of capital is important in two aspects where it is required. The first, the overall cost of capital is determined only on the basis of specific cost. Means the overall cost of capital of a particular company is determined on the basis of specific cost. Means you have to calculate the each cost of capital, then you have to find out the overall cost of capital. Second, where the profitability of a project is to be judged on the basis of the cost of specific source from which the project will be financed. Whenever the second, where it is important, where the profitability of the project is judged on the basis of the cost of specific source. The profitability is judged on the basis of cost of specific or cost of each source of capital whenever the project is financed on a particular project, the fund has been allocated. So there it is important. So specific cost one is important for the calculation of overall cost of capital. In another way, it is required for the calculation of weighted average cost of capital, and another one, it is required at the time of deciding or to calculate the profitability of a particular project. So specific cost is the cost of each components of a particular capital structure. The next one is a composite cost. It is an aggregate of the cost of capital from various sources. For example, the loans and debenture, preference shares and equity shares. It is the aggregate total of the cost of capital from various sources like loans and debenture, preference shares and equity shares. It is a total. Aggregate means total. The previous specific cost, it is on average. It is the average of all the specific costs of funds inducted into the capital structure of a company. It is the average of all the specific costs of the funds inducted into the capital structure of a company. So every specific average of the each specific cost is considered, or in another way it is also called as a weighted average cost of capital. So it is also called as a weighted average cost of capital. It has greater importance in the capital structure decision. So composite cost is also called as a weighted average cost of capital. Earlier I told specific cost is a weighted average cost of capital. No, specific cost is not weighted average cost of capital. It is the overall cost of capital. So it determines the cost of capital of each components of the capital structure, whereas composite determines the average of total of all the specific cost. So it's called as it is a weighted average cost of capital, whereas specific cost is called as a overall cost of capital. So that's all about the different class of classification of cost of capital or types of capital, cost of capital. These will you will easily understand these concepts whenever you solve the problems related to these. There are a lot of problems related to cost of capital, related to weighted average cost of capital, or about the internal rate of return. So then you are going to understand the concept, because there you are going to assess or evaluate the cost of each project, and then you will compare, then you will take the decision of whether we have to accept or reject the project. Then you will come to know the concept. So that's all about the classification of cost of capital. Thank you very much.